While we are watching developments in Russia, so too is the Clinton administration here in Washington. President Clinton and President Yeltsin have not spoken. The feeling is that that is not necessary at this time. Mr. Yeltsin has plenty to do, but contacts are being maintained both in Washington and in Moscow, primarily at the ambassadorial level and through the State Department and the Foreign Ministry in Moscow. These notes in from CNN's World Affairs correspondent Ralph Begleiter, who indicates that a senior administration official here reports that indeed the U.S. was notified by the Russian government that Mr. Yeltsin intended to send in what amount to the Russian special forces, that their orders are in fact, according to Ralph's report, not to initiate any action, but to return fire if fired upon. And that does echo what we are hearing in our reporting out of Moscow. In addition, this senior administration official acknowledges that it might perhaps be unrealistic to think that this series of events is going to end without additional bloodshed and perhaps additional violence in Moscow, that the U.S. is not necessarily banking on that. It is trying to take a realistic view of what is happening in the Russian capital at this point, which is not to say that the U.S. is giving in any way, shape, or form, according to this official, a green light to Mr. Yeltsin to do anything that might precipitate additional violence. It is also noted here, according to Ralph Begleiter, that U.S. officials have not seen any exceedingly difficult anti-Americanism other than some of the slogans that were chanted outside the Russian parliament, which is not very far from the U.S. embassy, but that those Americans in the capital do appear to be safe and not immediately threatened in any way, shape, or form. Also noted by this official is that there does not appear to be any spread of this problem in Russia beyond Moscow. There are wire service reports from St. Petersburg, formerly Leningrad, the second city of Russia, that their mayor Anatoly Sobchak has increased some of the local security, but that he has not chosen to call in the troops as Mr. Yeltsin has felt necessary to do in Moscow, and that there is calm in St. Petersburg, that the concern remains located and isolated solely in Moscow at this point. Earlier today, President Clinton, leaving the White House, did issue a statement and answered a few questions about the circumstances in Moscow. This is what Mr. Clinton had to say before he left the White House for California.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have received a rather extended briefing on what we know about what is going on in Russia, and I want to make a couple of comments about it. First of all, it is clear that the violence was perpetrated by the Rutskoye-Kashpilatov forces, that there has been significant violence today in Moscow. It is also clear that President Yeltsin bent over backwards to avoid the use of force, to avoid excessive force from the beginning of this. And I still am convinced that the United States must support President Yeltsin and the process of bringing about free and fair elections. We cannot afford to be in the position of wavering at this moment or backing off or giving any encouragement to people who clearly want to derail the election process and are not committed to reform in Russia. So we are following events moment by moment. As you know, we have access to television coverage there, so you are also pretty current on it. But that is the most I know now, and that is our position now.
Do you think that Yeltsin can survive, Mr. President, and will you cut off aid if he is deposed?
Well, I don't expect him to be deposed. I wouldn't overreact to this now. I think the people are clearly still far more supportive of him than Rutskoye or Kashpilatov, and they don't have any organized military support that we're aware of. So we'll just have to wait for events to unfold, but I have no reason to believe that he will be deposed.
Mr. President, have you spoken to President Yeltsin?
No. I'm sure he's got more important things to do right now than to talk to me, and I don't think the United States should be involved in the moment-to-moment management of this crisis, but I do want him to know of my continuing support and the support of the United States.
What can the U.S. government do right now, then?
Well, first of all, we can get as much intelligence as quickly as possible about what's going on, and we can do our best to look after the safety of the Americans who are there and the security of the embassy, which has received some attention from our folks, and so far the reports on that are good.
Do you have any plans to cancel your trip or postpone your
No.
trip in any way?
No.
What directions have you given our
No. Thank you.
That trip is carrying President Clinton to California, and that was several hours ago at the White House. Michael Beschloss, who's been sitting with me here all afternoon, do you sense anything in the American position that might be trying to anticipate the inevitability of force?
I do. There's been a little bit of movement even in the last 5 hours. At the end of the morning, the American position was what it had been for the previous 2 weeks, which was very much against almost any use of force. Now you see in background statements by administration officials, also by Senator Sam Nunn, who has been in touch with the White House and State Department, beginning to perhaps prepare Americans and the West for a possible use of force by the Yeltsin government in order to stave off this crisis.
And if force comes, it's where Gene Randall is, back in Moscow, where troops appear to be moving towards the center of the Russian capital. Gene, bring us up to date. What's the latest there?
Charles, once again, we are getting eyewitness reports. The tanks, armored personnel carriers are headed toward the center of Moscow, some as close as 20 miles away. We're also hearing from our people inside the Kremlin that they have spotted members of the elite Alpha Commando unit. This is the same unit that was ordered to storm the Parliament building 2 years and 1 month ago during the coup attempt against Mikhail Gorbachev. The unit refused to obey that order. This day's most dramatic events and this day's worst violence and bloodshed happened tonight at Ostankino, the Russian TV production center, and we can show you some pictures of that. There was very heavy firing after Alexander Rutskoy called in his followers to storm the building to take over Russian TV, and we can show you what it looked like. It was not pretty.
А вот когда в эту штуку... Hi, mom. Hey. А вот когда в эту штуку попаду, тогда будем разговаривать.
At one point, a fire was started inside that building as rebels overtook at least part of the building, the lower floor, the first floor. And Russian television managed to stay on the air, but the rebels were making a concerted effort to gain access to the rest of the building. Very heavy gunfire, and fear was a common denominator on all sides there tonight. No word on the final number of casualties. The action is still going on. Once again, this is the Russian TV center, about 8 miles north of where we are, in the center of Moscow. This is to the northeast. When we come back, we'll talk with Claire Shipman, who has been at the Russian White House until very recently. But first, we will take a break.
Nobody covers the world of sports like the people who cover the world.
Paris, France.
Tokyo, Japan.
New York City.
Cairo,
Los
Egypt.
Angeles, California.
There's only one talk show that links the entire world.
You can't have capitalism without capital.
I didn't say that.
Where issues and news events are open to global discussion.
I have a question on your policy.
NAFTA selling out Canada to the U.S.
Satisfied with how the war in Bosnia is handled.
The press is not being unfair.
Larry King Live. He's got the world talking on CNN International. CNN International updates global weather 24 hours a day. Look for the forecast for selected cities in your region and travel advisories worldwide. CNN International, your source for news, business, and sports, is now the place to turn for global weather. CNN International updates global weather 24 hours a day. Look for the forecast for these cities in your region and travel advisories worldwide. CNN International, your source for news, business, and sports, is now the place to turn for global weather 24 hours a day.
If you can't be there for all the excitement of global sports competition, on the field and around the track, stay on top of the action, the scores, and the highlights with CNN International every hour round the clock. And remember, CNN International brings you live coverage of breaking news from around the world.
The Iraqi president appears determined.
Live updates from Europe and the global hotspots.
The residents of Sarajevo forced to dodge snipers.
News features on lifestyles worldwide. International business programs. Plus live reports from the world's financial capitals. In-depth global weather. And interviews with entertainers and experts on international issues.
I get asked in lots of interviews, who are you prepared not to like?
For sports, news, business, and weather, turn to the one source seen in over 200 countries and territories. CNN International, the world's news leader.
Over 1 million species inhabit the Earth. Some great, some small. Each of them sharing the same ocean, the same land, the same air. But the indifference of man could impact every living thing. Earth Matters turns its focus on our fragile planet with a hard-hitting, aggressive look at people and the environment, confronting the issues and seeking solutions to our problems, taking bold steps to create a greener world. Earth Matters, Global Television's only weekly environmental series, Saturday on CNN International.
On a rooftop in Moscow, downtown, near the Russian Parliament building, is CNN's Gene Randall, a vantage point we've used often in the past 2 years or so of changes in what was once the Soviet Union, now Russia, still under the duress of trying to find its way into some form of democracy. And it hasn't moved that way tonight, has it, Gene?
No, it hasn't, Charles. A lot of speculation here, of course, as to whether before the night is over, Russian troops, now on their way to the city, will be asked to storm the Parliament building. My colleague Claire Shipman, until about 30 minutes ago, was inside that building. Claire, can you give me some idea of the atmosphere there?
Well, it was growing increasingly tense, Gene, when we left. The lack of lights, again, making it all the more ominous. One of the guards outside of Rutskoy's office told us that he himself was growing frightened. A lot of the Russian television journalists and print journalists there were also worried and were planning to leave the building. Although a top Rutskoy aide at the time we left said he still did not think there would be any sort of attack tonight.
Well, those parliamentarians, of course, for some weeks have been predicting that an attack was imminent. Now we have heard from some fairly highly placed government officials that, in fact, that's probably the only way to end this problem. Storm the White House, storm Ostankina, clear these attackers away. Is there much of a feeling there that this will happen tonight?
Well, I think that among the people outside of the Parliament building, yes, a lot of people are talking about it, and a lot of people see that as the only option. But again, some of the people inside, the deputies, are still... In fact, one deputy, he's the head of the Constitutional Commission, a parliamentarian, told us that he had just been talking with Rutskoy about an hour ago about proposals for a coalition government, and that he thought there was still hope that the two sides could talk and work something out.
Claire, in your view, from what you have learned inside that building, if there is an attack, will there be a defense, a strong defense, or will they simply lay down their weapons?
No, I don't think that they intend to lay down their weapons. They've made that clear every step of the way, and even tonight, they made it clear, the guards around Mr. Rutskoy, the other people who are armed there, have no intention of giving up without a fight.
All right, Claire, thanks very much. Claire Shipman, who has just come from the White House, the Russian Parliament building. Charles?
Gene, thank you. One quick question before you go, if you can still hear me, Gene, and that is, as the night progresses, it's what, 1 a.m. over there, so we can keep our clocks up to date? Is that about right?
Charles, just a second. It's 10 minutes to 12.
Okay.
10 minutes to 12.
I've lost track of how many hours difference, but I think it's the next few hours that, as they unfold, will certainly give a sense of what Moscow wakes up to in the morning. Do we expect...
Well, once again...
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Charles.
No, you.
Well, once again, the government is putting out the word. It expects to settle the situation very quickly. That came from the top, from President Boris Yeltsin and from those other members of the government who have been speaking out tonight. They expect to see this resolved quickly, and it's difficult to see how that can be done quickly without the massive use of force. Go ahead, Charles.
All right, Gene Randall, Claire Shipman, and all in Moscow, thank you for being with us all these many hours, and you probably have many more hours ahead of you. Here with me still, Michael Beschloss, who is the historian that we often count on to put these things in perspective. Give us a sense, if you can, what we have seen unfold today as to how we should look at Russia these days. What is it?
Well, I think if you had to really look at it in a grand way, here we are in a situation where Boris Yeltsin is trying to establish a democratic system. He has been trying to do that during the last 1 or 2 years within an old framework actually established during the last year or two of the communist Soviet Union. During the summer, there was a terrible impasse, a very great question over whether a referendum in April to have early parliamentary elections should be done. Finally, Yeltsin acted very arbitrarily, said we'll have parliamentary elections in December. That brought all this to a head. What we've seen in the last 24 hours is an effort, I think, of the Rutskoy-Khasbulatov faction, which would like to obstruct Yeltsin, to try to strengthen their hand. 1 day ago, they had almost no chance of prevailing. Now they have perhaps a slightly larger chance, but the great question is going to be whether they can thwart what seems to be the majority in Russia, which is in favor of Yeltsin.
What is it that happened in this day, as you suggest? It was not that long ago when they seemed to be virtually ready to collapse. Did Yeltsin fail to capitalize on some sort of opening or opportunity?
No, I think they, meaning the opponents of Yeltsin, felt that the blood was on the water. They would have to act now or be defeated essentially forever. And therefore they used what little was at their disposal, which was the ability to throw crowds into the streets of Moscow, put them at strategic sites, perhaps provoke the Yeltsin government to fire into the crowds and generate support for that opposing faction of Rutskoy and Khasbulatov that might not otherwise have been there.
Let's look at this for a moment, if we can, from the perspective of Mr. Rutskoy and Khasbulatov and their supporters. We have heard far more from the Yeltsin side and the establishment side, if you will. These are people who feel that they've got some sort of legitimacy. They feel that Boris Yeltsin has usurped the Constitution, acted unconstitutionally. We tend to refer to these, and the shorthand is easy to fall into, as hardliners, old communists, old guard. Is that fair to call them that, or are they within some right to say Boris Yeltsin's out of control?
I think if you interpret it in terms of the Constitution that prevailed a month ago in Russia, yes, the Constitution did not allow for this. Yeltsin is instead saying, I am not operating under the mandate essentially of the communist Soviet Union. I'm operating under the mandate of the referendum of April, the most recent countrywide referendum taken in Russia. Yeltsin's argument is that that mandate is for a new parliamentary election.
And throughout this, Mr. Yeltsin has had continuing, unwavering, it would seem, support from both President Clinton here and other Western nations for his action.
I think that's right. And the other reason for the unwavering support that he's had outside is that as bad as President Clinton might consider someone like Rutskoy or Khasbulatov if they came to power, those people are also the focus of a lot of other groups who would like to take power who are much more radical than the Rutskoy faction, as we said earlier. Hardliners in terms of Russian nationalists and fascists and neo-communists. Whenever you have a great political upheaval that is the result of a lot of groups getting together, you never know who's going to prevail in the end.
It is now October. President Yeltsin has called for these elections to take place in December. It's not a whole lot of time as we know it in terms of staging an election campaign. Is it for the Russians who have a lesser track record on holding these kinds of things? Is that time to get things calm, to get people to focus on a democratic process rather than what we're seeing now?
It's not the most desirable way of doing it, and I think perhaps the most desirable alternative open to him. And I might say, Boris Yeltsin is a very shrewd political tactician. He knows that if there's a short period of time allowed for a campaign, that gives the benefit to the incumbent, essentially him, who is able to exercise his will much more than a challenger who has to essentially improvise and bring together a movement.
And this maneuver today of ousting Mr. Rutskoy from his still remaining official position, declaring him no longer the vice president, even throwing him out of his military post, and this man was an honored military veteran, it further pushes him out and casts him out. Is it that significant?
I think Yeltsin probably would feel he was left with almost no other choice. Until today, when they were negotiating, it was in his interest to try to paper over some of these differences, see if they could get through this next period without the kind of open warfare that we're now beginning to see. I think at this point, Boris Yeltsin would have felt that for him to fail to do that would show weakness.
All right, Michael Bechelis, thank you for being with us all afternoon here. And to sum up very briefly the events that we've been watching in Moscow, a state of emergency declared by Russian President Boris Yeltsin. He says it will last until October 10th. By which time he hopes to have regained control. Out at Ostankino, the Russian television center, there has been the most extreme violence of these past 2 weeks. We're not sure how many are dead. We have heard reports of 8 dead and 100 injured. The numbers could certainly change as the effort by the opponents of Mr. Yeltsin to take control of the television station, apparently not succeeding because Russian television has remained on the air. There has been sporadic fighting elsewhere around Moscow this day, and Mr. Yeltsin has called in the elite troops to take positions around the Russian parliament to provide security and, as necessary, to perhaps, we do not know, even storm that facility. We're told that their orders are to fire back if fired upon. CNN will continue its coverage of the crisis in Russia, monitoring the difficulties that that nation has. I'm Charles Bierbauer in Washington.
Street fighting heard around the world. Russian hardliners shatter their 13-day stalemate with Boris Yeltsin.
And the world watches anxiously, awaiting President Boris Yeltsin's response to Sunday's vicious rioting. This is our continuing coverage of the crisis in Russia. I'm Jean Meserve in Washington.
And I'm Joe Oliver at the CNN Center in Atlanta. Pinnacle will not be seen, so we can bring you the continuing live coverage of events unfolding in Russia. A quiet but tense Sunday afternoon in Moscow became a violent seesaw of clashes, possibly careening toward the climax of a political struggle for control of Russia's government. CNN's Gene Randall is in Moscow with the latest. Gene?
Joe, it is another waiting game tonight, but it is a different kind of waiting game, waiting to see the response of Russian President Boris Yeltsin to the bloody, violent events of this day. And at this moment, we are told, a column of tanks and armored personnel carriers has arrived in the city and has taken up position near the Russian Defense Ministry, about 2 miles from the Russian White House. We were told earlier tonight that troops would move into Moscow from several separate directions. Obviously, some kind of staging going on now, and we're waiting to see if Boris Yeltsin is ready to use force to end this political stalemate once and for all, or at least to attempt to do that. There was some very bloody action tonight on the streets of Moscow, and Javon Darrow has a report that outlines some of it.
Armored vehicles and troops loyal to Boris Yeltsin fought off rebel fighters at Russia's main TV center. The forces, at the urging of renegade Vice President Alexander Rutskoy, attacked the TV station and battled for several hours before retreating the flaming building, undeterred by their wounds and vowing to return. Boris Yeltsin, who flew back by helicopter from his country house, promises to restore order, calling elite forces to Moscow to quell the unrest. Armored personnel carriers have begun rolling in on Moscow's main arteries.
Well, measures will be taken, very strict measures, to have Moscow quiet as soon as possible, maybe a day or something.
Earlier, the anti-Yeltsin demonstrators had their way and beat back riot police, forcing their way to the White House, braving tear gas, breaking the police cordon and taking control over the grounds. The crowd at the Russian White House was jubilant, sure of their victory over Boris Yeltsin. Many of the people that have come to the White House tonight have come here for the first time, no longer willing to stand on the sidelines. Pavel rushed here to sign up as a volunteer defender. I came here because I must defend the Constitution, he says. Others have come merely as spectators to witness this latest chapter in Russia's turbulent history. Siobhan Darrow, CNN, Moscow.
At least for a while tonight, pro-parliament forces, well-armed as they were, controlled at least part of the Russian Central Television facility. And we're told heavy fighting is continuing at this hour, and it is just after 2 in the morning, Moscow time. There were scores of wounded from Ostankino, the Russian TV production center. At one hospital alone, we were told more than 100 people were brought in to be treated for wounds. The death toll, 6 or 8, or possibly even higher. We certainly won't know until the morning. And once again, right now in Moscow, it is a waiting game, and it is very tense here. Gene Randall, CNN, Moscow.
Gene, we have not seen President Yeltsin since he arrived in Moscow. Any idea when he might make another appearance?
Well, he released his statement tonight in which he issued a state of emergency for Moscow. That was a written statement. We only saw him when he came back to Moscow by helicopter from his country home. We don't know when we expect to see him, perhaps when he thinks the situation is better in hand.
There was a wire report of a curfew at the White House. That seems kind of odd. Could you clear that up for us?
Don't know a thing about it, sorry.
Okay, Gene Randall reporting live from Moscow. Thank you very much.
U.S. leaders spent today answering questions about what, if anything, Washington should do about the crisis in Russia. While voicing support for Boris Yeltsin, Bob Cardin reports some are also adopting a wait-and-see attitude.
Gunfire and violence have created a state of fear and confusion in the streets of Moscow. But in Washington, the message is clear and direct. The United States stands firmly behind Boris Yeltsin and against his rivals in the Russian parliament.
I still am convinced that the United States must support President Yeltsin and the process of bringing about free and fair elections.
Still, Sunday's events demonstrate that Yeltsin's rivals will do all they can to force him from office. And while U.S. congressional leaders support Mr. Yeltsin, some, like Senate Armed Services Committee Chairman Sam Nunn, say the United States' first commitment should not be to an individual, but to a democratic process.
I think we've been correct in supporting Yeltsin. I think we ought to always hold out to the Russian people a broader vision than just supporting one individual, and that is a support of democracy.
Clearly, Mr. Yeltsin is seen in the United States as the person most likely to bring real reform to Russia. He has been popularly elected. Many of his rivals in the Russian parliament have not. Some of them want to return to the old Soviet Union. Yeltsin has thus far not used significant military force to put down the rebellion. That restraint has gained sympathy among U.S. congressional leaders. They urge Mr. Yeltsin to follow that course and to call for elections.
The answer to the problems of democracy is more democracy. Calling for elections would be consistent with that principle.
Meanwhile, Senate Minority Leader Robert Dole says the West may be contributing to Yeltsin's problems by forcing economic reforms on Russia too quickly.
Senator Mitchell and I supported aid to the Russian Republic. We think that's appropriate. But maybe we have to go back and take a look whether or not we're moving them too quickly to a market economy.
What do you think? Mr. Yeltsin has declared a state of emergency, effectively suspending democratic rule in Russia. Many U.S. leaders say that's a painful but necessary response to the worsening political situation. Bob Cardin for CNN, Washington.
We are now going to go back to Moscow and to Walter Rogers, who is inside the Kremlin. Walt?
In the Kremlin tonight, Boris Yeltsin is probably spending the most painful night of his presidency. He knows he must give the order for troops to retake government buildings which were taken by the hardline parliamentarians, and that is certainly going to cost lives. With us now is Vyacheslav Kostakov, Mr. Yeltsin's press secretary. Mr. Kostakov, how is Mr. Yeltsin bearing up?
He's in a very decisive mood, though rather tired. I think that during this night he took some 15 minutes of short sleep, and now he works for tomorrow's appeal to the nation.
Is there any question in your mind but that he must now act very firmly, very decisively and strongly tonight?
Certainly. I believe that he should draw very hard lesson from what happened in Moscow today. There is no more possibility for compromises with the communist opposition, with the Soviet, and I think that he should take maybe even advantage of this disastrous situation and to take blow to the rest of the communist regime in this country.
What is he hearing from his military commanders in the various regions?
News are rather coming and good. All military regional chiefs pledged their full support to the President Yeltsin.
And one last question. I know you're very tired, but in your mind, how can this end? There's only one way. Is there more than one way this can end?
It's difficult to judge now, because clashes in Moscow still are underway. There is a lot of military oppositionary forces who came to Moscow from regions to support the Soviet, to support Khasbulatov and Rudskoy. They are well trained. They are not so much numerous, but very well trained in Pridnestrovia, in regional conflicts. They are real bandits and fanatics, and it's rather difficult to fight them. Since the army is on the side of Boris Yeltsin, I think everything will end good.
Mr. Kostakov, thank you very much for talking to us now, and we wish you could get some sleep from here on out.
Thank you.
Thank you. And so you've heard it from here in the Kremlin, the latest news that Mr. Yeltsin has received reassurance from his military commanders that they are still with him. That is, of course, very good news for Mr. Yeltsin. And now it's just a matter of waiting to see how this tragedy plays out. It will certainly have a bloody ending. Other sources in Mr. Yeltsin's office have told us that the fighting will commence later tonight, and there may even be efforts to retake some of those buildings before dawn. Walter Rogers for CNN, live in the Kremlin.
When our broadcast continues in just a few minutes, we'll talk about the volatile situation in Moscow with a journalist just back from Russia. And we'll bring you all the latest developments from the Russian capital as they occur when our coverage of the crisis in Russia continues.
Kashmir. When you hear people say, yes, but what does advertising do? Tell them, it creates competition, which cuts prices, improves products, and gives better value, which can't be bad, especially if you're a consumer. Advertising, the right to choose.
It's going to be different every week. The King of Talk has come to weekends. Take it away, Jay Leno. We're going to try to be a little offbeat.
Oh, stop saying things about people.
And it's going to be more free-for-all.
Weights. Work out with weights.
Turn down ballet, by the way. God, I would go crazy if the show were politics only.
Ah!
Television will never be the same.
You be the judge.
Larry's working the weekend. Oh, come on, this beats work. Sunday on CNN International.
Gotta get out of here.
It is just after 2 o'clock in the morning in Moscow. The city is now under a state of emergency declared by President Boris Yeltsin. The declaration came after thousands of hardline protesters overwhelmed police and attacked the city government and television station. Just hours ago, a string of 40 armored vehicles bristling with cannon and machine guns rolled into position outside the Defense Ministry and near the Kremlin. An aide to Russian President Yeltsin says his government is coping with the turmoil.
Unfortunately, this group of highly aggressive people whose world outlook belongs with the past have been armed in the White House, and they have seized the initiative from the hands of the government's troops, and in scattered groups were moving towards and battling for the key information centers. According to our data, they have not been able to succeed in these battles, but I have to state that the government troops were on the defensive.
There are unconfirmed reports that 8 people were killed in today's violence. More than 100 were wounded. Joining us now to lend some insight into the Russian crisis is a man who knows Moscow politics well. Michael Dobbs is a journalist. Until earlier this year, the Moscow bureau chief for the Washington Post. He is also working on a book detailing the collapse of communism. Thank you for joining us tonight. First of all, do you think that there's any chance that the hardliners are going to come out on top?
I think there is a slight chance if the units that have now been brought into the capital do not show decisiveness in the next few hours and re-storm the White House, the location of the Russian parliament. But I think the forces that Yeltsin has at his disposal are so overwhelming that the chances are that he will put down this rebellion, and he will put it down very swiftly.
If the hardliners did perchance come out on top, what would the future look like?
Well, the people in the parliament's camps are themselves deeply divided. I don't think Rutskoy or Hasbulatov are extreme communists by any means, but they are dependent on a ragtag of different groups, and I think they would very swiftly be drawn into a very extremist position. I think that such a government would be very anti-Western, it would be very nationalist, it would try to resurrect the former Soviet Union, and that would be extremely dangerous.
What is your take on how things degenerated to this point?
I think that in the last few days, Yeltsin had a chance to show a much more decisiveness and end the siege. He didn't do that. He allowed the parliament to become a focal point for resistance. I also think that Rutskoy, to some extent, lost control over his own supporters, and as soon as they went and attacked the television studios, that gave Yeltsin the pretext he needed to crack down hard, which he's now using.
Do you think he is going to do that tonight?
I think in the next few hours, as his spokesmen have indicated, there will be a violent attempt to storm the White House, and I'm afraid that will lead to a considerable loss of life. I think everything is pointing in that direction now.
And what is that going to do to public sentiment in Moscow and in all of Russia?
Yeltsin can say that it was the other side that started the violence. The other side used guns to storm the television studios, and I think that most people will probably take Yeltsin's side. They may not take it as they may not be so passionate about it as some of the supporters of the Parliament building, but I think he still has majority support among the population.
If events do play out as you forecast they will, what will the coming weeks and months be like? Will things be very rough and rocky?
Yes, although Yeltsin can, I think, gain control of the Parliament and the television studios fairly swiftly, it's going to be much more difficult for him to regain complete control over the country. There's a possibility that a defeated Parliament may turn, some of their supporters may turn to terrorist acts. There are a lot of guns in the White House. There's certainly going to be some people who will escape the events of this evening with their guns. And beyond that, it's going to be very difficult for Yeltsin to push through the economic reforms that he plans without a good deal of pain for ordinary people. So I think there's going to be a lot of trouble and difficulties ahead for him, even if he comes out on top tonight.
Michael Dobbs, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Joe, back to you.
Georgian rebels are upping the pressure in their attempt to drive President Eduard Shevardnadze from power. They seized 2 more Georgian towns this weekend within 150 miles of the capital, Tbilisi. But the towns are nearer still to Georgia's second largest city. Its loss could deprive Mr. Shevardnadze of an important base in western Georgia. The government lost its last remaining port city to rebels yesterday. U.S. troops come under attack in Somalia today. 1 deadly blast and 2 helicopters shot down. Just ahead, we'll have more on the violence and the possible political damage.